George of the Squamish Nations. It's an extra special blessing here this morning. At this time, we're going to ask Dr. Stephen Hwang, is it Hwang? Dr. Stephen Hwang, I think I said it properly, to come up. He's with Research Science at the Centre for Research on Inner City Health at St. Michael's Hospital. It's part of Canada's crisis, the hidden cost of homelessness. Yeah, I see him over there. So please give a nice warm welcome to Dr. Stephen Hwang.
Hi, good morning everyone, and thanks everyone for turning out. It's great to see you all. It's a real honor and a privilege to be here and to talk to you. So I'm going to just speak briefly on this topic. So I know most of you probably know more about this topic than I do, so I'm just going to speak briefly about three things. I'm going to talk about the hidden crisis of homelessness and what I mean when I say that. I'm going to talk about the hidden costs of homelessness, and I think that there are perhaps some insights from research that might help us as we try to convey this to others in the general public. And thirdly, I just want to reflect with you a little bit about what I think is the role of research in helping to deal with this crisis. And during that, I'm going to just briefly talk about the group of researchers and community organizations that form the Research Alliance for Canadian Homelessness, Housing and Health, which is called REACH3. So when I talk about the hidden crisis of homelessness, I think that there are a couple of facts that we know that are actually helpful, I think, to convey what we're talking about. And especially to people who are not, I think, necessarily extremely informed about the issues, or perhaps not as immersed in them as many of you may be. So first of all, there has been a study in which they did telephone interviews of Canadians, and this was calling people in their homes, so none of these people were homeless when they were called. And they asked these people, have you ever experienced homelessness, literal homelessness, meaning really living on the street or in a shelter or living with someone because you had no place of your own? And have you been homeless in the last 5 years? And 2% of the people that were surveyed said that they had in fact been homeless in the last 5 years. So what this means is that 500,000 Canadians have been homeless in the last 5 years. And interestingly, this statistic, which was actually from a few years ago, is not that different from the parallel statistic from the United States. So the 2% figure and the 500,000 people is, I think, one that's worth keeping in mind and trying to understand, help people understand. So this does raise some interesting issues around what I call the hidden crisis of homelessness and vulnerable housing, because, and I'm going to use data from Toronto because that's what I'm most familiar with. In Toronto, there are about 5,000 people that are homeless on any given night, and that includes about 4,000 people using shelters and 1,000 that are on the street or in institutions. And obviously that varies from city to city, but in Toronto the number is 5,000. However, we also know from our shelter data, which is very comprehensive, that there are 28,000 different people who use shelters over the course of a year. So the obvious question when you look at these numbers is, okay, tonight there are 5,000, over the year there are 28,000, where are those other 23,000 people over the course of the year? And what this really, I think, highlights is the fact that there is a huge population of people that we call in REACH3, in our group, the vulnerably housed. And again, I think that this is very familiar to all of you, and this is not like rocket science, but I think that it's a concept that people in the general public often don't really grasp or understand, because they think of homelessness as just the people that they see on the street, and they don't realize that that is really just a symptom. That those people are really just the tip of the iceberg of a much larger group of people who are vulnerably housed. And just if we were to define this as people that are paying more than 50% of their monthly income on rent, and based on, this is data from the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, CMHC, we know that across Canada, these individuals have an average income of about $14,000, an annual income, and it means that each month, on average, they have about $470 left after they pay their rent. As you all know, this means that they're often living in housing, if they're housed, they're living in housing that's in poor physical condition, often lacking in basic safety, security, and space. And they're often making painful choices. Obviously, I think that it's important to realize that while those choices may mean paying the rent or buying food, it's also important when conveying this to people beyond those who are, again, more in the know, that many of those who are vulnerably housed are families with children. So these are often parents with young children, and so literally the kinds of choices that they have to make are am I going to buy school supplies for my kid? Am I going to pay for transit to take them to the doctor? Or am I going to pay the rent or buy food? So I think it's important to realize that the concept of vulnerable housing does not apply just to single adults, but really is something that affects households and families and children across Canada. So this graphic is just a way of trying to convey that to people. If this one person inside the red box is a person who is homeless today in Canada, what we know is that for each one person like that, sleeping in a shelter, there are 23 vulnerably housed households across Canada. So I think that really, I think, drives home the fact that this is the issue of housing and vulnerable housing is a much larger issue in magnitude than that of homelessness alone. And this means that right now, today, there's about 380,000 vulnerably housed households across Canada. So that's just a bit about the idea that we have a hidden crisis, and that this is something that is far larger than I think people realize, and is having a huge impact on our society. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about the hidden costs of both homelessness and vulnerable housing. So there is clearly a personal, individual cost of homelessness and vulnerable housing. And these are graphs which essentially are from a study that we did a few years ago that show that homeless and vulnerably housed people have much higher rates of mortality. They're much more likely to die than people in the general population. So these are what we call survival curves, and they essentially show people dropping off as they get older. And the steeper and the earlier the curve falls off, the worse it is. And the first curve to go down, the brown curve, if you can see it, is those people across Canada who are homeless, living in shelters, or living in hotels or rooming houses. So it includes both homeless people who are experiencing homelessness and vulnerable housing. So just to put this in terms that I think are a bit easier to convey to people, the cost in terms of individual suffering and death is that the dark bar represents, on the left side is men and the right side is women. This shows essentially the probability of surviving to age 75. And the average person in the general population of Canada, just focusing on the men at the left, the average man in Canada who's 25 years old has about a 63% chance of surviving to age 75. And that's pretty good and reflects the overall health of Canadians. But for men living in SROs, rooming houses, and shelters, they have only about a 30% chance of surviving to age 75. Again, these are statistics that I think you all realize, but I think that these numbers drive it home, because what this means is that the life expectancy of a man living in a rooming house or an SRO or a shelter today is about that